The scene was processed correctly. The key material was secured as evidence. Nothing essential was missing. What failed was not the investigation, but the science needed to understand what the evidence had been saying all along. From the outside, the investigation appeared thorough and complete. Officers interviewed witnesses, traced movements, and followed every lead that surfaced. But none of those paths led to a person who could be directly tied to the crime. No confession came. No witness placed anyone at the scene at the critical moment. Physical evidence, as it was understood then, could not be linked to a named suspect. As weeks turned into months, the working assumption hardened. Whoever was responsible had left no usable trail. The violence seemed personal, yet no personal connection could be proven. Without a suspect to pursue or a method to push the evidence further, progress slowed. Eventually, the case shifted from active pursuit to periodic review. The file remained open, but unanswered. What had once been urgent became unresolved, preserved more by record-keeping than momentum. But one aspect of the case never fully settled into that explanation. The evidence itself had never disappeared. It had been carefully collected, catalogued, and retained under protocol. It was not circumstantial or second-hand. It was physical, direct, and uncontested. And yet, it produced no answers. At the time, that absence was interpreted as limitation. Certain tests simply did not exist. Certain comparisons could not be made. The tools then in use could not measure it. Without a reference point, the material meant nothing on its own. It did not identify a person. It did not narrow the field. It just sat there, inert. What made this uncomfortable in hindsight was not what investigators failed to do, but what they had already done correctly. The clue was unchanged. It had survived time, handling, and storage. Nothing about it degraded its potential value. The problem was that its value could not yet be measured. Years later, when methods changed, that same evidence would behave very differently. It would no longer remain silent. The unresolved question was never whether the clue existed. It was whether anyone yet had the ability to understand what it contained. If you're listening along, you can share where you're listening from. Now, here's what happened to Michelle Martinko. The victim was Michelle Marie Martinko, age 18, last seen in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in December 1979. She was a senior at John F. Kennedy High School and lived with her parents on the northeast side of the city. At the time, investigators focused on the belief that the attack was personal in nature, a theory that would shape the direction of the case for decades. Michelle was known as a reliable and socially active student. She participated in school activities, including choir and twirling, and was regarded by teachers and classmates as disciplined and outgoing. She had plans to attend college after graduation and was, by all accounts, living a routine life consistent with that of many high school seniors in Cedar Rapids at the time. On the evening of the 19th of December 1979, Michelle attended a school choir banquet held at a downtown hotel. The event ended in the early evening hours. After leaving the banquet, she decided to stop at Westdale Mall, a large indoor shopping center on the southwest side of Cedar Rapids. Her purpose was straightforward. Her mother had placed a winter coat on layaway, and Michelle intended to pay the remaining balance. Michelle drove the family's tan 1972 Buick Electra to the mall. She arrived alone. Inside the mall, she was seen by several people, including classmates and store employees. Witnesses later recalled that she appeared normal and unhurried. There were no reports of arguments, distress, or unusual behavior. At one point, Michelle briefly spoke with a former boyfriend while inside the mall. The interaction was casual and unremarkable. She continued shopping afterward. The mall was crowded due to the Christmas season, and nothing about her presence stood out. As the evening progressed, stores began closing. The last confirmed sighting of Michelle occurred near a jewelry store shortly before the mall closed for the night. After that point, there were no verified observations of her inside the building. When Michelle did not return home as expected, her parents became concerned. In the early morning hours of December 20, her father reported her missing. Cedar Rapids police began checking locations Michelle was known to frequent, including Westdale Mall. At approximately 4 a.m., officers located the Buick Electra in the mall parking lot near the JCPenney store. The vehicle was parked in a corner of the lot, away from heavy traffic areas. When officers looked inside, they found Michelle in the front passenger seat. She had been stabbed multiple times. The wounds were concentrated on her face, neck, and chest. Defensive injuries on her hands indicated she had attempted to resist the attack. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators immediately secured the vehicle and surrounding area. There were no signs of forced entry into the car. Michelle's purse was still inside, and cash she had been carrying was not taken. There was no evidence of sexual assault. These details contributed to the early belief that robbery was not the motive. The brutality of the attack drew particular attention. The number of stab wounds suggested sustained violence rather than a single, impulsive act. Based on this, detectives initially theorized that the killer may have known Michelle or targeted her for a specific reason. This assumption would guide many early investigative decisions. The crime scene itself presented both clarity and limitation. Blood was present inside the vehicle, including on Michelle's clothing and parts of the interior. Some of the blood did not belong to Michelle. At the time, however, forensic testing could not determine much beyond basic blood typing. DNA profiling did not yet exist in criminal investigations. No murder weapon was recovered. No usable fingerprints were found. Investigators believed the attacker likely wore gloves. Without traceable physical markers, the case quickly became difficult to advance. News of Michelle's death spread rapidly through Cedar Rapids. Students at Kennedy High School learned of the murder the following morning. Classes were disrupted, and counselors were brought in. The community response was immediate and intense, marked by fear and disbelief. For investigators, the case was active and urgent, but from the beginning, it was constrained by the same problem that would define it for years. The crime had produced evidence, yet that evidence failed to resolve to a named suspect. At the time, no one could know that one of the most important elements of the case had already been secured. It would remain preserved, untouched by relevance, waiting for a future method that had not yet been invented. From the moment Michelle Martinko's body was discovered, the investigation moved quickly and methodically. Cedar Rapids police treated the case as a top priority. Detectives secured the vehicle, documented the scene, and began reconstructing Michelle's movements during the final hours of the evening. The mall was canvassed, store employees were interviewed, and officers worked to establish a clear timeline of who had been present and when. Investigators began by identifying everyone who had contact with Michelle that night. Friends, classmates, Former romantic partners and casual acquaintances were questioned. Officers followed up on sightings inside the mall and attempted to determine whether anyone had followed her to the parking lot. At the time, there were no surveillance cameras covering the exterior of Westdale Mall, and interior footage was either non-existent or too limited to be useful. This absence of visual records immediately narrowed what could be confirmed. The physical evidence collected from the car was processed according to the standards of the late 1970 seconds. Blood samples were retained, clothing was preserved, fibers and hairs were collected where possible. Fingerprints were dusted for and photographed. No usable prints were recovered, reinforcing the belief that gloves had been worn. The murder weapon was never located, and no nearby areas produced a knife or sharp object tied to the crime. One of the earliest challenges investigators faced was motive. Michelle's cash remained in her purse. Her car had not been taken. There were no signs of sexual assault. These facts eliminated several common motives and directed attention toward a targeted attack. Based on the nature of the wounds and the absence of theft, detectives theorized that the perpetrator may have known Michelle or had fixated on her specifically. That assumption shaped the investigation for years. Considerable effort was spent examining Michelle's personal relationships. Former boyfriends were questioned extensively. Friends and classmates were asked about conflicts, arguments, or unusual behavior. Teachers and school staff were consulted. No evidence emerged, suggesting Michelle was being threatened or involved in disputes. Those closest to her consistently described her life as stable and routine. Despite this, investigators continued to pursue the possibility that someone within her social circle was responsible. Polygraph examinations were administered to multiple individuals. None produced results that could support an arrest. Over time, each person of interest was eliminated through alibi verification or lack of corroborating evidence. Investigators also examined the possibility of a stranger attack. Westdale Mall was crowded that evening with holiday shoppers. Police attempted to identify anyone whose presence or behavior appeared out of place. Mall employees were questioned about unfamiliar individuals or disturbances. Witnesses were interviewed repeatedly. Some recalled seeing men in the parking lot late in the evening, but no description was specific enough to isolate a suspect. To generate new leads, police employed techniques common at the time. Witnesses underwent hypnosis in the hope that suppressed memories might surface. 2 individuals provided descriptions that were later used to create a composite sketch. The image depicted a young white male with curly hair and average build. It was circulated publicly, but it did not result in a viable lead. Tips continued to arrive. Hundreds were logged, reviewed, and ruled out. Some pointed to individuals with prior violent offenses. Others stemmed from rumors or secondhand claims. One man who committed a knife-point sexual assault weeks before Michelle's murder was examined closely. His background warranted attention, but physical evidence failed to link him to the crime, and he was ultimately excluded. As time passed, progress slowed. Investigators faced a persistent barrier. The evidence they had collected could not be advanced further with the tools available. Blood typing could place samples into broad categories, but it could not resolve identity. Hair and fiber comparisons were inconclusive. Without fingerprints, a weapon, or a witness who could identify a face, the investigation reached an impasse. One missed opportunity later stood out. Months after the murder, Investigators learned that a potential witness had seen a man standing near a car resembling Michelle's in the mall parking lot during the early morning hours. The information had not been reported immediately and reached police too late to pursue. By then, the moment had passed, and the individual could not be identified. This delay did not result from negligence, but it highlighted how fragile investigations were before rapid communication systems. Information traveled slowly. Leads depended heavily on timely reporting and individual judgment. Once time passed, even accurate observations could lose investigative value. By 1980, the investigation had plateaued. Detectives reviewed their work repeatedly. Supervisors re-examined theories. Files were reorganized. The same questions produced the same conclusions. Without new information or new technology, the case could not move forward. Over the following years, the Martinko case was revisited periodically. Cold case reviews were conducted throughout the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds. Each review reached the same determination. The evidence had been handled correctly. The investigative steps were sound, yet the case remained unresolved. One factor was not yet recognized for its future significance. Among the retained evidence was blood that did not belong to Michelle. At the time, it could be typed, but not individualized. It did not match anyone investigators tested. Without a suspect for comparison, it remained unusable. No searchable database existed. This limitation explains why the case stalled despite having a central clue from the beginning. The investigation did not falter due to indifference or error. It stalled because science had not yet caught up with the evidence. By the mid-1990 seconds, Michelle's parents had both passed away without seeing an arrest. The case file remained open but inactive. It was stored, reviewed occasionally, but no longer driven by daily investigative momentum. The unanswered questions remained alongside the preserved material. When DNA profiling entered criminal investigations in the late 1,980 seconds and early 1,990 seconds, the Martinko case was still years away from benefiting. Early testing required larger, cleaner samples than were available. It was not until 2006 that investigators revisited the blood evidence with a new understanding. Until then, the investigation remained defined by its original constraint. The crime had produced proof, but the proof could not yet identify a person. That limitation, more than any missed lead, explains why the case remained unsolved for nearly 4 decades. The file did not close because the question had been answered. It grew quiet because there was no longer a way to ask it. Decades after the killing, the case changed for one reason. Evidence that could not identify a person in 1979 could now be examined in a way that produced an individual profile. The shift did not happen in a single step. It unfolded through a series of scientific advances, each one extending the usefulness of material that had already been retained. The first change involved redefining what usable meant. In the late 1,970 seconds, blood evidence could be grouped by type. That allowed investigators to exclude some suspects, but it could not reliably isolate one person. Hair and fiber comparisons were similarly limited. They could suggest consistency, but rarely certainty. Without fingerprints, a weapon, or an identifiable witness, the case remained locked. By the early 2000s, forensic DNA analysis had become standard practice. Rather than examining an entire genome, Laboratories focused on specific regions of DNA that vary widely among individuals. These regions, known as short tandem repeats, or STRs, function as genetic identifiers. An STR profile does not explain what occurred. It serves as a unique marker, capable of distinguishing one person from another. When investigators returned to the Martinko evidence with these tools, their attention centered on biological material that did not belong to the victim. Blood found in the vehicle and on clothing could not be explained by Michelle alone. This detail mattered because knife attacks frequently result in what investigators describe as a fender bleed. During a struggle, an assailant may cut a hand or knuckle, leaving blood even in the absence of fingerprints. The objective became precise. If an unknown male profile could be extracted from that blood, the case could move from theory toward identification. Forensic specialists worked carefully with the preserved samples. Because the material was decades old, analysts had to account for degradation, possible mixtures, and contamination risks. Despite those challenges, a usable profile was developed. Once an STR profile exists, its value depends on comparison. National databases provide that function. In the United States, the Combined DNA Index System, known as CODIS, allows laboratories to compare profiles across jurisdictions. A match can link a crime scene profile to a known offender or to another crime. Investigators submitted the Martinko profile to CODIS. The logic was straightforward. If the offender had been convicted of a qualifying crime later in life, his DNA might already be in the system. A match would identify him immediately. No match was returned. That result narrowed the field without closing it. It indicated that the offender's DNA was not present in the database. He may have avoided felony convictions, avoided arrest altogether, or lived a life that never required DNA submission. The profile existed, but it was not attached to a name. With CODIS exhausted, investigators needed a different approach. Instead of asking who the profile belonged to, they asked what it could reveal indirectly. At this stage, DNA was used in a broader investigative role. One method involved forensic DNA phenotyping. This process does not identify a person by name. It estimates certain physical traits based on genetic markers, such as probable ancestry and features like hair or eye color. These estimates are probabilistic, not definitive, but they can help guide attention. In this case, a laboratory produced a composite image informed by the DNA profile. The goal was not replacement of eyewitness evidence, but redirection. Earlier sketches had relied on memory and hypnosis-based recall. The new image was derived from genetic data. It provided a different basis for public awareness. Even so, a composite alone does not resolve a case. It generates tips, not proof. It can reshape assumptions, but it does not produce an arrest. The next development did. It relied on the principle of shared genetics. Investigative genetic genealogy works on the fact that relatives share measurable portions of DNA. Close relatives share more, distant relatives less. But even partial overlap can signal a family connection. Public genealogy databases contain DNA profiles uploaded voluntarily for ancestry research. Under certain conditions, these databases can be used to identify familial links relevant to criminal investigations. The Martinko profile was compared against one such database. Instead of searching for an exact match, investigators looked for partial matches indicating family relationships. The results produced distant relatives rather than a direct hit. From there, the work shifted to analysis. Genealogists constructed family trees, tracing lines of descent, marriages, and branching relationships. Each step reduced the number of possible individuals who could fit the profile. This process required time and precision. A shared surname did not end the inquiry. Each branch was evaluated against age, sex, geography, and elimination history. Gradually, the pool narrowed. Eventually, genealogical work identified a small group of men who fit the criteria. They would have been adults in 1979. They lived within a feasible distance. They had not been excluded previously. None had appeared in the original investigation. At that point, the investigation returned to traditional police work, guided by a new framework. Genetic genealogy provided direction, not proof. Confirmation required a direct STR match between the crime scene profile and a known individual. To obtain that comparison, investigators needed DNA samples. When voluntary samples were not available, they relied on discarded DNA. Items such as drinking straws or napkins, once discarded in public, can be collected as abandoned property. Saliva cells left on such items can be analyzed. Investigators conducted surveillance on the remaining candidates. When one individual discarded a straw in a public place, it was retrieved and submitted for testing. The laboratory compared that DNA to the crime scene profile. The profiles matched. The statistical likelihood of such a match occurring by chance was effectively negligible. The comparison established that the same individual who discarded the straw had left blood at the crime scene. To confirm the result under controlled conditions, investigators obtained a warrant for a cheek swab. That sample produced a complete profile. It matched again. At that point, the case crossed a threshold. The genealogy work had pointed the investigation toward a person. The STR match confirmed that person's DNA was the same DNA preserved since 1979. In court, it would be essential to distinguish lead generation from admissible proof. Genetic genealogy explained how investigators arrived at a suspect. The conviction would depend on the direct DNA match and the documented chain of custody. What changed was not the evidence itself. The blood had always been present. The clothing had always been stored. What changed was the ability to interpret those materials using tools that did not exist at the time of the crime. That sequence explains why the title holds. Police had the clue from the beginning. It remained preserved. Science did not create it. Science made it readable. Once it became readable, it pointed, step by step, to a person who could be tested and confirmed. In a case without fingerprints, without a recovered weapon, and without eyewitness identification, method became the pathway. Not as a replacement for detective work, but as a means of giving that work a measurable anchor. The clue remained unreadable for 39 years because there was no way to translate it into a person. When that translation became possible, the investigation moved again. When the preserved evidence was examined using these newer methods, the results did not support the assumptions that had guided the case for decades. Instead, they redirected it. For years, investigators believed the crime was personal. The violence appeared focused. The absence of theft or sexual assault reinforced that view. Much of the early work centered on people within Michelle's social orbit because that explanation seemed consistent with what could be observed at the time. The DNA evidence did not support that conclusion. As genetic genealogy narrowed the unknown profile to a specific family line, investigators assembled a list of possible individuals. The list was not built on behavior, rumor, or proximity to the victim. It was based on shared genetic markers and documented family relationships. As that list took shape, it became clear that none of the individuals under consideration had any known relationship with Michelle. That realization marked the turning point. The evidence was no longer pointing toward familiarity. It pointed toward chance. The working theory shifted away from a known attacker and toward an opportunistic encounter. As genealogists refined the family tree, the list narrowed further. Investigators focused on men who would have been adults in 1979, lived within a reasonable distance, and had not been excluded earlier. None of them had surfaced during the original investigation. At this stage, the work moved from analysis to confirmation. Investigators began discreet surveillance of the remaining candidates. This was not an arrest phase. It was a verification phase. The question was specific. Did any of these individuals share the same DNA profile recovered from the crime scene? One individual became the focus when genealogical mapping showed he fit the genetic relationship pattern precisely. To verify that connection, investigators needed a direct comparison. The opportunity arose when the individual discarded a drinking straw in a public place. The item was collected, logged, and submitted for analysis. The DNA extracted from the straw was compared directly to the profile developed from the blood preserved since 1979. The profiles matched. The probability of such a match occurring by chance was vanishingly small. The result meant that the blood recovered from the scene belonged to the same person who had discarded the straw. For the first time in the investigation, the evidence did not merely suggest direction. It established identity. With that result, investigators obtained a warrant for a formal DNA sample. The cheek swab produced a complete profile under controlled conditions. It matched the crime scene profile again. The conclusion contradicted decades of assumptions. The individual identified had no documented connection to Michelle. There was no evidence of prior contact. The crime was not driven by an ongoing relationship or dispute. It resulted from a brief encounter that escalated into fatal violence. The breakthrough did not arrive with spectacle. There was no confession, no recovered weapon, no eyewitness emerging years later. What changed was alignment. Evidence that had existed independently for decades now converged on a single conclusion. Blood that could not be interpreted in 1979 now carried a definitive signature. The absence of fingerprints no longer mattered. The missing weapon no longer prevented progress. The lack of eyewitnesses no longer defined the case. The investigation moved forward because the evidence could finally be read. What had once been a dormant file in storage now reached resolution. When the DNA comparison returned a match, uncertainty gave way to confirmation. After nearly 4 decades, the question that had defined the case was no longer theoretical. It had an answer. The results led investigators to Jerry Lynn Burns. For the first time in decades, the case advanced beyond speculation. Burns was identified through a direct DNA match between the profile developed from the preserved blood evidence and a sample obtained during surveillance. Investigators then obtained a warrant for a confirmatory cheek swab. That test matched the crime scene DNA. On the 19th of December 2018, exactly 39 years after the murder, Burns was arrested in Manchester, Iowa. He was 64 years old. He had no prior convictions for violent crimes and had not been a suspect during the original investigation. Burns was charged with first-degree murder and entered a plea of not guilty. The case proceeded through pre-trial hearings and went to trial in February 2020. Due to extensive publicity in Cedar Rapids, the trial was moved to Scott County, Iowa. Prosecutors relied primarily on forensic evidence, presenting the DNA results, the documented chain of custody, and expert testimony explaining the statistical certainty of the match. The defense challenged the evidence but did not offer an alternative explanation for how Burns's DNA appeared at the scene. Burns did not testify. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. Under Iowa law, the conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Burns was sentenced later that year. He appealed the conviction, arguing that the collection and use of DNA evidence violated constitutional protections. In 2023, the Iowa Supreme Court upheld the conviction, ruling that the investigative methods were lawful and that the DNA evidence was properly admitted. With that ruling, the case reached its legal conclusion. Evidence collected in 1979 had finally produced identification, arrest, conviction, and sentence. This case was not solved because of chance. It was solved because someone chose to look again. The investigation did not change because of a confession or a delayed witness. It changed because evidence that had been preserved was re-examined when science made new questions possible. The outcome depended on patience, record-keeping, and the willingness to revisit what had already been secured. The case also illustrates the limits of assumptions. Early theories guided the investigation, but they were shaped by what could be known at the time. When new tools became available, those theories were tested rather than protected. There is a quieter lesson as well. Justice can move slowly, but preservation matters. Evidence handled correctly can retain its value long after its significance is understood. In this case, nothing new had to be discovered. What changed was the ability to interpret what had been there from the beginning. For nearly 4 decades, the case remained unresolved not because it lacked proof, but because the proof could not yet speak. When it finally did, it answered a question that had remained open for most of a lifetime. Where are you listening from? And if stories like this matter to you, consider following along.